I can't believe how long ago this was now. Time sure flies. I'm a lot older now, but I remember this like it just happened. I remember it was October, and the trees were already in full fall colors. I'd gone down to Missouri to visit my parents. They weren't getting out much at the time, so when I showed up, they took advantage of my help. I'd been busy with my business and hadn't been spending very much time with them during the past 5 years or so. We decided to pack up the RV and the boat and go to Truman Lake for some deer hunting. My mom was excited because we were doing something together for a change. It really did feel good to be home again. We set out in the middle of the week and drove 3 hours to the lake. The nice thing about that campsite was that the Army Corps would leave the campsite amenities turned on for the fall deer hunting season. So we had it pretty easy and didn't have to rough it too much. The area we went to was pretty far into the woods. We were kind of surprised that we were the only campers in the whole park, but I guess that it was because it was midweek. We unloaded the boat and began setting up our camp. I don't know how it is now, but back then, there was a lot of deadfall along the shoreline of the lake, and you really had to watch out for stumps under the water, or you'd throw a prop, which wouldn't be a good thing. Anyway, we were looking for signs of deer along the bank, so we could set up a good blind to hunt from. It took us about an hour, but we finally found a good spot in the back of a deep cove, about 20 minutes from camp by boat. My dad and I used to go hunting there all the time, so it all came back to us really quickly, and we worked well together. We set up 2 blinds, one on each side of the cove, toward the end, so it could be covered in both directions. Then we went back to camp for dinner and some sleep, while the alarm went off and we were up getting ready for what we hoped was going to be a successful day. When we got going, the first thing we noticed was there were no sounds coming from the woods around us. Like, none. Not even the wind was stirring. It felt weird, but we assured it was just the earliness of the hour. We got on the boat and started her up and headed for the blinds. We arrived just as the sky was starting to lighten up, and we tied the boat up about 100 yards from the blinds. We proceeded on foot, but the whole time there were still no sounds at all, except for the sounds of us passing. Then, right at the same time, both of us were hit with a feeling of dread. My dad looked at me, and I looked at him, and we didn't know what to think. We kept looking around, but there was no sign of anything unusual besides the quiet, so we both tried to shrug it off. When I found the blind I had set up, or what was left of it, I became keenly aware that we weren't alone in those woods. My blind was all messed up, and there were tracks all over the place. I couldn't tell what kind because they were in loose gravel, being on the shoreline, but I knew they hadn't been there yesterday. Over by my dad's blind, it was the same thing. The materials from his blind were all strewn around like some kind of warning from someone who didn't want us there. My dad was really riled up, but we had no idea what we might be dealing with, so we thought we'd better head out. As we got closer to the boat, we noticed something was wrong with it. It was sitting deeper than usual in the water. When we got to it, we found that someone or something had punched a hole in the waterline with a big rock that was still lodged in the hole. Now, this boat was one of the toughest aluminum hull boats you could buy. It was incredibly sturdy, and my dad had taken it out on some pretty rough trips, and it had withstood a lot. My dad crawled into the boat and turned on the bilge pump, and it seemed to help. The whole time, we felt like eyes were watching us. My dad pumped enough water out so we could get it further on the shore and patch the hole. with a life jacket and duct tape. He was just finishing up the repair when we had heard a rustling in the trees behind us. We turned around and saw a towering figure coming out of the undergrowth. The first thing that occurred to me was that it was a bear, but the thing was huge, like 8 feet tall. It was covered with shaggy brown fur, like a bear, but the body was incredibly muscular. The head was more like an ape, or maybe a caveman, with a really pronounced brow, like what you'd imagine if you came across a Neanderthal. When it emerged from the trees, we could smell this incredibly rank, musty body odor. We were just frozen in place, staring at it. But then, it let out this low, guttural growl. That's all it took for my dad and I to start stumbling over each other and trying to get on the boat. We cast off, and it let out another roar. This time, louder and more menacing. We got back to camp and packed up really fast. We tried telling my mom it was because I had ran the boat into an underwater stump, but she could tell we were lying and got the truth out of us. We hightailed it out of there so fast and have never been back there since. From everything I've read, it sure sounds like that was a Bigfoot, but I'd been to that lake countless times before. My favorite thing in life is going on outdoor adventures with my family. I work hard most of my time, so about once a year, it's all worth it. My family and I will drive across the country and have life-changing experiences together. A couple of years ago, my wife, our 2 kids, and I were on a road trip when we got to Freetown, Massachusetts. Freetown is known for being an absolutely hot spot for all types of paranormal activity. I'm talking Bigfoot, aliens, government conspiracies, ghosts, spirits, time travelers, glitches in space-time continuum, you name it. Now, I had always heard about these strange sightings, hauntings, and unexplained phenomena in the area. However, I had never experienced anything out of the ordinary there myself. Anyway, as we were all driving through there, all of our vehicles suddenly began to experience electrical issues at the same exact time. The lights on my Jeep, my son's car in front of us, and my daughter's car behind started to flicker on and off. The radio was turned off and on, the AC, everything. Then, all of a sudden, all 3 of our cars just stopped working entirely. The engine shut off, and we all slowed to a halt. We all just sat there pulled over on the side of the road. None of our cell phones worked, and nothing electronic worked at all. We all got out of the car to try to figure out what the hell was going on. There was a tall black mass, darker than the night sky, looming in the distance. It was so dark that it seemed to absorb any light around it. The mass took the shape of a human, and it seriously freaked me out. It just stood there in the middle of the road, looking at us. We were all in shock, and we just watched in terror. Then suddenly, the black mass disappeared, and all of our cars and cell phones suddenly turned back on. We all just looked at each other, completely shocked by what had just happened. After a few moments of silence, my wife spoke up and suggested that we get out of there as fast as possible. We all figured that was a good idea and jumped into our cars and started driving away, trying to put as much distance between us and the black mass as we could. None of us could believe what we had just seen, and we were all in shock. We all just silently kept driving, trying to shake the experience off and get to a safe place. Eventually, we made it to a nearby town and stopped at a gas station to fill up and regroup. We were all shaken up and trying to make sense of what had just happened. We talked about all kinds of things. Was it a hoax? Was it just a man in black clothes? Was it some sort of government experiment or secret technology? But deep down, we all knew what we had seen was beyond human capabilities. We continued down the road and stopped at a hotel after a couple more hours of driving. All of us were exhausted from the drive and completely shaken up by this strange black mass that had rendered us immobile. We decided to do some research on the area and the black mass that we had witnessed. We figured we couldn't be the only ones who had experienced this. We came across numerous articles and reports of sightings of shadow men in the area, in the Bridgewater Triangle. The Bridgewater Triangle is what they call the surrounding area that Freetown, Massachusetts was in. It's essentially described as the second Bermuda Triangle because of all the unexplained paranormal activity that occurs in the area. People had reported seeing these shadow men lurking in the woods and even their own homes. There were several accounts of people who had even reported physical contact with these shadowy entities. Scratches, bites, bruises, and several accounts of these shadow men holding them down as they awaken. As we read more and more accounts of these shadow men, we got increasingly freaked out. I mean, it was one thing to have an experience like ours, but the fact that so many people had reported seeing these shadow men made it all the more terrifying. We knew that we had to come face to face with something truly evil, and it was not something we wanted to ever experience again. The reports we found ranged from recent sightings to those dating back decades. It was clear that this was not a new phenomenon. These shadow men had been haunting the area for a long time. We even found stories of Native American legends about dark entities that lurked in the woods and preyed on travelers that sounded exactly like what we had experienced. As we continued our road trip the next day, we still couldn't help but feel on edge. We kept the radio off and our eyes peeled for any sign of the shadow man. It was a life-changing experience that opened our eyes to the terrifying reality of the paranormal. We knew that we would never forget our encounter with the shadow man and that we had to warn others to be cautious when traveling through the Bridgewater Triangle. Encountering the shadow man in Freetown, Massachusetts, then learning about the phenomenon of shadow men in the Bridgewater Triangle changed our family in many ways. It was an experience that brought us all much closer together and made us realize how fragile and unpredictable life can really be. It also opened our minds to the existence of the paranormal and the possibility of otherworldly beings that we had never considered before. It is now a family tradition of ours to swap stories about the Bridgewater Triangle. Every day, there are tons of stories that pour out of that place. It's absolutely wild. I've always been a fan of horror movies and spooky stories, but I never really believed in the paranormal phenomena until I visited this abandoned insane asylum in Pennsylvania. They had set up a haunted house attraction in one of the buildings of this former insane asylum. The former institution for the mentally and physically disabled, located outside of Philadelphia, had been shut down after years of chronic overcrowding and patient abuse. I was fascinated by the history of this place and had always wanted to visit. But as soon as I discovered the reality of being in that place was far from what I had imagined. I had heard about the haunted house that had been set up in the Penhurst former administrative building and decided to check it out. I had never experienced anything paranormal before, and I was excited about the thrill of it all. As I entered the museum that featured photos and information about the institution, I could sense a heavy atmosphere, as if the air was thick with scarring memories and pain. As I made my way through the haunted house, I couldn't shake off the feeling that someone was watching me. I originally dismissed it as my imagination and the effects of the haunted attraction, but then I heard a sound like a child's laughter coming from an empty room. It was clear that this wasn't part of the attraction. When I turned to investigate, I saw a shadowy figure dart across the doorway. It happened so fast that I thought it might have been a trick of the light. Despite feeling freaked out, I pushed on and explored the area further. I left the haunted attraction and started walking around the old buildings of the abandoned asylum. I walked through the underground tunnel system that used to connect the buildings. As I emerged from the other side, I ended up in the room of the original morgue. That place was freaky. The paranormal events immediately became more frequent as I continued my exploration of the morgue. I saw things move out of the corner of my eye, and I heard footsteps echoing in the halls. At one point, I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck, but when I turned around, no one was there. The experiences escalated over time, and I started to feel like I was losing my mind. I got really dizzy and nauseous and kept getting disoriented. Shortly after this, I bumped into a group of people who had also experienced paranormal activity in Pinehurst. They had formed a small investigation team and were trying to uncover the truth behind the strange occurrences. They invited me to join their investigation, and I felt like a kid in a candy store. As we delved deeper into our investigation, we found out that the paranormal activity in Pinehurst was caused by the spirits of the patients who had suffered and died in the institution. They were trapped in the space, unable to move on to the afterlife. As we uncovered the truth, the paranormal activity around us escalated, and we began to experience real physical danger. At one point, a freaking coffee mug was hurled at us by an unseen force, and it forcefully smashed through a window. Had that hit one of us in the head, it might have killed us. I was terrified of what might happen to me and the investigative team, and I struggled to keep my composure. I'm not gonna lie, I started to lose it a little bit. It was freaking terrifying. All of a sudden, one of the investigators screamed and fell to the ground, breaking and shattering some of his very expensive equipment. He was covered, and I mean covered, in scratches that broke the skin and went all along his body, and we knew that we had to be careful. We were all seriously on edge at that point, but the potential for capturing evidence was unlike any of us had seen before. We set up our equipment and prepared to stay overnight to capture any evidence of paranormal activity. As the night progressed, strange wails and crying sounds echoed throughout the abandoned halls. Doors slammed shut by themselves. One of the guys captured a low demonic growl on a voice recording that said, "You're next." One of our team members suddenly felt an icy hand on their shoulder, and they screamed out in terror. When we checked his shoulder, he had third-degree burns on it, and it was blistering up. It was at this point that we were ready to get the hell out of there. Then, in unison, all the flashlights stopped working. We were trying to get out of there without lights, but the place was a freaking labyrinth, and we just kept walking around aimlessly, trying to find the exit. The screams of the anguished spirits were so loud, it was hard to tell if it was coming from a member of our group or not. Then, when we were making our way down a long staircase, this demonic scream bellowed out, "Get the hell out." Then it pushed us down the stairs, and we all tumbled down, the equipment going everywhere, and all of us had some pretty gnarly bruises. We were all screaming, and I was sobbing at this point, praying I was going to make it out of there. One of the guys on the investigation team threw a piece of his equipment at the window to break it, and we all desperately climbed out of there, slicing ourselves up pretty good on the broken glass on the way out. As we were tending to our wounds, we realized one member of the group wasn't with us. One of the members of the investigation team crawled back in there and discovered that at the bottom of the staircase was the unconscious team member. We all helped him pull him through the window, and the team took him off to the hospital. I never heard from them again, but it was the first and last time I ever messed with those kinds of forces again. I remember this one time when I was hiking deep in the Appalachian Mountains. It was a beautiful autumn day, with the leaves on the trees displaying a stunning array of colors and the air crisp and cool. I'd taken a few days off work to explore a remote section of the trail that I hadn't visited before. I'd been hiking for a couple of hours when I decided to take a break near a small stream. As I sat down to rest and have a snack, I heard a faint, pitiful whimpering sound coming from a nearby thicket. My curiosity piqued. I approached the source of the noise, wondering if it was a lost or injured animal. As I pushed aside the branches, I was shocked to find a small, furry creature huddled there, shaking and scared. At first glance, I thought it was a baby wolf or coyote, but as I got a closer look, I realized it was something much stranger. Its body was covered in thick, dark fur, but its face had distinctly human features, a mixture of both animal and human that was both fascinating and unsettling. I couldn't leave the poor thing there, frightened and alone, so I carefully picked it up, wrapped it in my jacket, and began making my way back to the trailhead. The whole time, I couldn't help but wonder if what I'd found was a baby werewolf, a creature I'd only ever heard of in legends and myths. When I finally reached the trailhead, I decided to report my find to the local authorities. I figured they'd know what to do with the creature and would be able to help it. The nearest ranger station was only a short drive away, so I loaded the baby werewolf into my car and headed there. Upon arriving, I hesitantly presented my discovery to the rangers on duty. They exchanged glances before one of them disappeared into a back room, only to return with an older, more experienced-looking ranger. He took one look at the creature and immediately ushered us into a private room. The older ranger explained that they had heard of similar creatures before, but had never actually seen one. He told me that I'd stumbled upon something that was meant to remain hidden, and that it was crucial I never speak of my discovery to anyone. He promised they would take care of the baby werewolf and ensure it was safe, but that I had to leave it in their care. With a heavy heart, I agreed. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had stumbled upon something truly extraordinary and mysterious. As I left the ranger station, I couldn't help but feel a pang of sadness for the baby werewolf, but I knew it was in the best hands possible. To this day, I've kept my promise and never spoken of my encounter with the baby werewolf. But sometimes when I'm hiking in those remote sections of the trail, I can't help but wonder what became of the creature and if it ever found its way back to its own kind.